first go-kart drive of my Factory 5 Mark IV Roadster, or Cobra replica. I've been working on this car for about 4.5 years, and this is just going to be the initial go-kart drive, and I'll make some comments with observations as we're going through it. Here I've started the car and I'm letting it warm up a little bit before I go to back it out of the shop. One thing I'll note right off of the bat is that the calibration in the ECU is completely guessed at this point, and so it's really not very good. And I had not been running the car very much. It had been sitting for a while without running, so I was letting it warm up a bit before going. The transmission was very firm at first, being a brand new Tremec TKO, and I'll say that within the first 50 miles it's definitely loosened up a little bit as oil has made its way through to all of the various parts. That smoke you see coming off of the passenger side exhaust manifold was related to two items. There I'm pointing at it and asking my wife to take a look and see if anything's on fire, which it's not. Basically, the two items were that both of the rocker covers, driver's and passenger side, had one bolt that was loose, and so that was allowing some oil to drip onto the exhaust manifold. The other thing has turned out to be that there's some oil coming out of the breather, which I think has to do with the fact that these rocker covers don't have a baffle on them. Also, again, the car's been sitting for a while, so and it hasn't been run very much, so some of that is also some residual oil from a previous run burning off. It does decrease substantially. It looks really bad now, though. Engine stalled there, and another thing is that I was having my wife check the positions of the ramps. Coming out of my shop there's a bit of a lip, and so want to drive over the ramp so as not to bottom out the car going in or out. One thing to note is that the idle increased after the engine had been running a little bit, and it did so on subsequent drives. I think some of this just had to do with everything getting broken in and the plugs getting cleaned off a bit. It had just had short runs under no load previously. Just to give you a point of reference, looking at the gauges from left to right on the top, you've got coolant temperature, oil pressure, and then on the top right you've got oil temperature. And then on the bottom, those two gauges are air-fuel ratio on the left, and then just the fuel gauge on the right. The air-fuel ratio being pegged all the way to the right is actually indicating that it's running very lean. Again, this was a guessed calibration, and I made some changes later, but that I think was part of why it was running kind of chugging along, and why it stalled a couple of times. It gets better as I drive further. I've had some people ask me why I was wearing a helmet on my first drive. There were a couple of reasons for this. The first one was that this car doesn't have a windshield on it, and so I was wearing it in part for just general face and eye protection. This is my normal motorcycle helmet. It's comfortable and it does those things well. But one of the other big reasons why I was wearing the helmet was that I have my headset in there, which I can use to then make phone calls. In this case, my wife is following me in her car on the drive, and so I had her on the phone the entire time so that she was able to call out anything that she saw behind that I may not have noticed. So it's always a good idea when you're doing a first drive to have a chase car if you can. Here I've shut it off because my wife told me that she was seeing coolant coming out of the engine. Actually, it was my son who had mentioned that. It wasn't actually coolant leaking out of the engine. What it was just the overflow hose getting a couple of little bits of coolant going out. This wasn't a problem, but because they had said coolant, I turned the engine off to make sure it didn't overheat.
Exactly what we're looking
Checked
for.
it, everything was fine, get back in, and then ready to go. Okay, so meanwhile, this is actually a good opportunity to let the electric water pump do its electric water pumping, and it's working. So, okay. No, that was a good one. If you can see, the speedometer is the gauge on the left by my left hand behind the steering wheel. You can see that the needle is almost pointing straight up and down, which is 80 miles an hour. It has not been calibrated at this point, and it was therefore significantly off, but at least it was working. That's what I really cared about. thing you'll notice throughout this is that I do try to accelerate and decelerate and change gears and change the RPMs quite a bit. This is a new engine, and there's different philosophies on braking in the engine, but the one that I tend to go with is varying the load and varying the RPMs while not beating on it in the case of an engine like this, so to help get the rings seated and all of that. So I'm doing a lot of that more than anything for that reason, and then also just to generally get the feel of how the car is and how the engine's performing. Here what I'm doing is I'm turning on the heater or vent, and I'm testing to see if I'm noticing a difference. First off, if heat's coming out, but then I also get to where I open and close the heater valve to see if I can notice a difference in the amount of heat coming out of it. The heater does actually work, but I'm not noticing it shut off heat when I close it, whether that's because it's just drawing hot air in or whether it's not shutting off coolant. I'm not sure. I still have to look into that. If you watch the air-fuel ratio gauge here, one of the things that you might notice is that it's getting to a better mixture when I'm at these somewhat higher RPMs. I got it as high as 5,000. It doesn't have any throttle tip-in enrichment, it seems, so it gets really lean when I put more throttle in, but then once it comes back, it seems like it was more in around that 14-ish to 1, which is still a little bit leaner than I wanted at this point, but good enough for the time being. The purpose of the go-kart drive is really just to take it on a quick trip where you can see if everything's working right, make sure that there's nothing obvious that would result in a reason why you would have to do major work that might be easier to do with the body off of the car, like having to pull the engine again, which would be probably the absolute worst case scenario. So I just went from my house to the highway and back, and just here I'm turning around, and everything has been working well so far. there I briefly put it into 5th gear. On the TKO, the 4 to 5 RPM drop is significant, and at this speed, which is well below highway speed, it was a bit lower RPM than I wanted, especially with the new engine not calibrated right. So basically spent most of the time driving in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th gear, mostly 3rd and 4th. So that was the test drive, just a quick out and back, and was really happy with how the car performed. It didn't have any abnormal or bad characteristics, whether it was with engine operation or handling or anything of the sort. Really couldn't have gone a whole lot better. I did make some notes for things to address and got those corrected, but otherwise a couple of days later we put the body on the car and kept on progressing with getting it fully ready to be a complete road car. Thanks for watching this. I hope you found it useful or interesting if you are building one of these cars. And I have to say it was a little nervous going into it, just because there's so much work that you do on one of these when you're building it, and you don't know what it's going to be like at the end. But it put a huge smile on my face to see this actually happening and get to drive it, everything coming together pretty much exactly as I had expected it to.